I always record these videos right after I shower, so my hair always looks super greasy, and I don't know why I haven't learned my lesson yet. Welcome back, everybody. Remakes, we all love them. That's not true, I don't know why I said that. I will say though, after a lot of mediation, a lot of critical thinking, I don't actually dislike the abundance of remakes that we're getting. I know, blasphemy, and from such a high-profile individual, no less. But I've always found remakes and remasters to be pretty beneficial for somebody who skews on the younger side of gaming enthusiasts. To put it bluntly, there are a lot of games, a lot of classic games that are pretty old, and a lot of old games that are hard to access. Emulation helps quite a bit in that regard, but it's a bit of a niche thing to do. It hasn't become as normalized as pirating movies and shows was before the streaming boom, and even now. So to most people, a lot of games are locked behind the consoles that they were released on. If an interested party doesn't know about or doesn't want to go through emulation, they already have a massive hurdle and usually a massive price point to overcome. But even if they do decide to go the emulation route, you're still playing a game that wasn't designed with modern sensibilities, so the controls will probably be a bit wonky, visuals can be a bit off-putting, especially from games that were considered groundbreaking at the time, because spoiler alert, they use some crazy workarounds that look ridiculous today, and the overall gameplay will also probably feel stuck in the past. It depends on how far back you go, of course, but it's no secret that games, like most things, become technically superior as they go on, and with the rapid growth of this industry in comparison to other forms of entertainment, that gap is more important here than anywhere else. As much as I love going back and playing older, classic games, it's a lot harder to get into that mindset than it is to buy a newer, bad game, and I feel like most people feel similarly. Remakes allow people who have never played those classic games to experience them in a whole new way. It may not be technically the exact experience that shook the world when it first came out, but it's an easily accessible and more appealing alternative to a lot of people, one that can often get you interested in full franchises. It's a name that you've always heard and a game that you've always wanted to play, free from the constraints that made you avoid it or continuously put it off. It's the reason I finally got around to Demon's Souls, it's the reason I played Resident Evil 2, and mark my words, if this ever happens, it's gonna be the reason that I get into the Metal Gear Solid series. Considering what industry we're in, how often it changes from underneath us, and how far we've come, I don't mind remakes, and I'm not gonna be one of those people who complain about how many we're getting, because they're either being created by small teams within a bigger team that's working on something else, or they're made by dedicated remake studios. It's not like they're taking away from other stuff. If they didn't exist, they wouldn't magically be replaced by an amazing new original game, so who cares? I mean, I guess it does take away some resources and talent, but in the grand scheme of things, if we stop making remakes, the industry doesn't shift entirely. That all said, I hate how broad of a term remake is. A game can use the same AI, combat system, and story as another game with brand new assets, and it's a remake. At the same time, you can add new characters, a bunch of new content, change the number of dimensions the game has, change the combat system, change the genre, and change the story, and it's still a remake? Like, how do we have the same name for both of those things? I also kind of hate that it sometimes feels like the wrong games are being remade, and to make matters worse, there's this really odd aversion some of them have to improving gameplay and making it feel more modern because they're worried that the game will lose its charm, which is a pretty weird mindset to have when you're recreating a game for modern times. Remakes aren't bad, but their definition is kind of flimsy and confusing, and that leads to flimsy and confusing end products. So today we're going to ask two questions. When does a game deserve a remake, and what should a remake actually be? And just for clarification, I'm talking strictly about remakes and not remasters because this video was supposed to be 8 minutes long, and I think I went a smidge over that, so yeah, I didn't want to add anything extra. As far as that first question goes, I think it's really simple to just sit here and go, well, it has to be old enough. It has to be old enough, and then it has to have been good to begin with, but you can make it better. And it has to be old enough. And first of all, very good point, me from 2 seconds ago, but as the astute among you may have noticed, those qualifiers are a little bit vague. What is old? Is it a certain amount of years? Is a remake after 14 years fine, but 13 years is a no-go? Are we really gonna set up a definitive TTR? That seems impractical. Is it instead bound by console generations? Games from 2-3 generations ago get the green light, everything after doesn't, but then what if they were cross-gen or received a remaster already for the previous generation? Plus there's a big difference between early-gen stuff and late-gen. Being definitive isn't the solution. You get a different set of rules from everyone, and there's so many factors that go into it. To me, the biggest qualifiers for a remake are availability and a shift in the genre or series that justifies a new take. Let's tackle that second one first. A few examples of this are the Final Fantasy VII Remake and the Resident Evil 2 Remake. Full disclosure, I don't actually love either of these games, not because they play bad or they shouldn't have been remade, but because of separate issues. I don't like the bullet sponginess and pacing of 7's remake, and I never got close to finishing that one, and I thought Resident Evil 2 was a little boring. It just wasn't scary, like, at all, and I'm not the biggest fan of the 10 meters per hour running speed. I did like the level design though, and I actually finished this one. All that said, I'm glad these remakes exist because they're the product of long-running franchises and genres that have changed so much over time, they're barely recognizable anymore. Final Fantasy VII was a turn-based JRPG with text-based dialogue. The series is now 3D action RPGs with full VO, so to try and make a remake that's truly faithful would be kind of ridiculous. So now with this new approach, they're able to take actual liberties in its creation. This is a what if it was made today type of remake, and I think those are the most inspired and overall the most exciting. Resident Evil 2, same thing, maybe not as drastic of a change on paper, but taking the game from a weird stationary camera model to a fully realized 3D space, perfect. These feel like games that truly contribute to the industry and give us kind of an old game that everyone loved and kind of a completely new game as well. Examples of games that don't do this are the Crash Bandicoot and Sane trilogy and the Demon Souls remake. Ironically, two games that I vastly prefer to the last two I mentioned. They remain rooted in the foundations of the original, serving as more of a visual remake, not just in terms of resolution, but also in art style, atmosphere, and texture. While they may not need to exist because of any seismic shifts in how platformers and Souls-likes play today compared to back then, they do fit the bill of games that have low availability, my second major qualifier for remakes. One of the reasons the remake discussion is at an all-time high right now is because of The Last of Us Part 1, a game that's announcement has left people pretty divided. I know, I'm shocked too. I'm supposed to be locked up too. The Last of Us of all franchises is dividing people? That's crazy. What a crazy time we're living in. People have never had vehement disagreements about this franchise before. I mean, granted, I haven't been on the internet in 2 years, but how much could this really have changed in that time, right? The biggest talking point with this game is whether it even deserves to exist. And you have three schools of thought here. No, it doesn't deserve to exist, and I'm not gonna buy it. No, it doesn't deserve to exist, but I'm still gonna buy it. And yeah, it does deserve to exist. With absolutely zero survey data or due diligence, I'm gonna confidently say that 90% of people lie in these two camps, and while some are set in either, for others it's a slider. If the game comes out and has Last of Us 2 level gameplay and completely reworked encounters, they land here. If it has some of those things but not others, it's a bit more blurred. And if it's just a nice little facelift, that's not nearly enough to justify its purchase. Regardless of where you land now and when the game comes out though, it's safe to say that most people are of the mindset that of all the things you could remake, this feels like it wasn't exactly on the top of the list. But why is that? Is it just because of how little time has passed? That's definitely part of it, but also this remake is coming 9 years after the original, which is not much shorter than the 11 years between the original Demon Souls and its remake. Not enough of a difference for this much of an uproar at least. I think there's a few other factors that add up to the mixed reception of this announcement. The Last of Us was far more cutting edge visually than Demon Souls ever was. It was immensely popular out of the gate and started people retroactively becoming more and more interested as the developers of the game became more mainstream. And there's obviously the base controversy that you're gonna get with The Last of Us nowadays. That's right, I have been on the internet in the last 2 years. You've fallen right into my trap. But the biggest difference to me is I can just play The Last of Us right now with no hassle on my current console, and it'll still feel great to play as long as you actually like the combat in the original. I never understood why people didn't because I always liked it, but whatever. Demon Souls is different. It was confined to the PS3 and emulators. I wanted to play this game back in 2019, but I'd have preferred it to be on my current console, and I wasn't sure how much I wanted to seek it out specifically since I knew it was known as the experimental, least polished Souls game. So when it got a remake announced, it fixed a lot of the problems that I didn't have with The Last of Us, which has a PS4 remaster version which is backwards compatible on the PS5, and wasn't notorious for being the video game version of an art film that some people just wouldn't get. I think Resident Evil 4 actually proves this point of availability best when compared to these other games. Its remake is also getting a bit of chatter about whether it's necessary or not, less than The Last of Us, but from my experience, much more than Demon Souls, despite having the longest gap of the three between its original and its remake, 18 whole years. And I think the reason why is Resident Evil 4 is reaching Skyrim levels of being put literally just everywhere. There's not a device on the planet that doesn't play Resident Evil 4. You're playing it right now as you're watching this video. Nice shot, dumbass. So it doesn't feel like a remake is necessary because we have easy access to good versions of the game. Ideally, a remake is made when it checks both of these boxes. Like I said, my dream remake would be for Metal Gear Solid 1, a game and series that I want to get into, especially from the beginning, but I also know from looking at it that it'll have a bit of trouble holding my interest, not to mention it doesn't have a native PC version or a PS4/5 version. Not only would my purchase of a remake be driven by the fact that the game isn't easily available, but I'm gonna guess that said remake would follow suit with future entries and be a full 3D stealth game, which is a lot more appealing to me. The only real question at that point is how much you trust Konami, and actually, you know what? Maybe I don't want a Metal Gear Solid 1 remake. It's fine if it only checks one of these two as well. The original Final Fantasy VII is right there on the PlayStation Store, and the Demon Souls remake doesn't change much of how the original plays, because could you imagine if it did? Oh my god, the Souls community would just eat Sony. But I have noticed that both of these types of remakes contain a fatal flaw that, if avoided, can make them way better across the board. So that brings us to, what should a remake actually be? It's easy to sit here as somebody who doesn't make creative decisions and isn't under the supervision of a power-hungry company to say, it's pretty simple actually, it's just one sentence, but It's pretty simple actually, it's just one sentence. I kinda mentioned it earlier, but it all comes down to what if we took blank and made it today? And you might be thinking, wow, what a great take on remakes. This guy's a genius. Ugh, why didn't I think of that? But just hear me out, alright? Obviously having this mindset and actually executing it effectively are two different things, but I think you'd be surprised with how much this basic rule isn't followed, and I think that's what contributes to the messiness of video game remakes. What's important is that you don't just fill this blank in with the game's name, because that poses way more questions than it does answers. Instead, what you gotta put in here are the biggest strengths of the game that you're recreating. A good remake should have the level of flexibility that goes past its visuals, but it can't go so far as to unearth the best things about the original in pursuit of that flexibility, because, I mean, then what are we doing here? The whole reason you remade this is because people resonated with that stuff. Don't change it now. That's why I think most people agree that Resident Evil 2's remake is one of, if not the best remake ever made. Even I feel that way, and I don't even like the game all that much. Because it said, what if we took the atmosphere, characters, location, and goofy charm of Resident Evil 2 and made it today? Simple. Bing bang boom. The game features a lot of changes, but what made it great wasn't its weird presentation, it wasn't the non-connected rooms, it was this stuff. So keep that intact, and now make a modern game outside of that. Just go nuts. I mentioned Final Fantasy VII alongside Resident Evil 2 as remakes that make massive changes in attempts to do right by this end of the sentence, which I admire, but it stumbled and divided fans by not retaining incredibly important aspects of what made the original great. When people talk about Final Fantasy VII, it's the characters and story that stick out to them the most, and while most people can accept the new characters here and there as well as larger roles for some of the old ones, what was far more controversial were the major story changes that they made, specifically in regards to an important character's death, with it looking like the entire narrative could be flipped on its head going forward. From my understanding, again as somebody who doesn't know much about the original or new story and doesn't really follow this franchise, there were a lot of micro changes and moments to flesh out characters that eventually dominoed into something that sets up a totally different second and third acts. That seems like a weird move considering how the story is so key to the love of the original. By not keeping that intact and potentially fracturing it even more going forward, you're not really remaking this game, you're rebooting it and getting away with telling a lot of the same story beats as last time, which seems a bit dishonest and confusing. The overhaul of the combat and the overall look of this game were major changes, but they weren't what the game was known for, and the Final Fantasy franchise has been moving towards this for a while, so it wasn't exactly jarring, but to a lot of people, this was. And I know there are fans that actually like the new direction the story is taking, but I feel like at that point, just take these characters and make it a full reboot. If I made a little drawing of a stick person, then I drew him again with a proper body, that's me remaking the same image again in a new way, but if I redrew him into a scene where 100 other things are happening, that's not a remake, that's just the Marvel Cinematic Universe. On the other hand, you have a lot of games that feel terrified of changing anything, even if it would be incredibly beneficial to the game overall, because they're afraid purists are gonna chuck tomatoes at them for not maintaining the perfection that was the original game. I'll never understand why people believe their favorite games were 100% the exact vision of their creators with zero compromises made and no tiny details awry whatsoever. The fits that people throw when a clearly outdated and ineffective portion of the game is tweaked to be better in a remaster or remake is unbelievable. And I think it makes developers believe that they have to either change almost everything or they have to change nothing. The Insane trilogy had a weird mix where it sometimes felt kind of old when playing it. It wasn't anything that broke the game, but it didn't play in a modern way because it was built off the feeling of the original games, but they did tweak the checkpointing and the speed of falling and the exact handling, so like, just make it feel like a modern game then, with the original levels and enemies. Why does Shadow of the Colossus' remake have the same frustrating controls as the PS2 version? Could it not have been brought up to standards just a little bit? Demon's Souls committed to using the entire skeleton, faults and all, of the original, and that's when you end up with a jaw-dropping, cutting-edge visual experience that features a boss that has the brain of an undead chihuahua. Just flying in place for 40 minutes or getting stuck in weird places or finding a home underneath the bridge, why would you not fix this stuff? Why would a remake, something that's meant to free an old game from the bounds of old hardware and time constraints, intentionally keep those constraints because otherwise, God forbid, it would change for the better? And this is coming from a person who actually likes that I got, for the most part, outside of the visuals, the exact same experience that I would if I played the original Demon's Souls, because I wanted to play the original Demon's Souls. But if this remake decided to be a bit more ballsy, not only fix issues, but hell, throw in some of the enemies that never got used, finish the unfinished Archstone, not only would it have had the chance to unlock the potential in a game that had so much more to give, but if I really wanted to play the original, either as a fan who refused to accept the changes or one that just wanted to check it out in its original form, I can do that with just a little bit of elbow grease. It's not ideal for that type of player, but it is an option, whereas a version of this game that's polished visually and in gameplay isn't an option, and I think if you're gonna make a modern version of a game, you have to commit to that. Fandoms are so crazy, you're gonna piss people off with every move, but you might also get others on board, and I wish certain remakes weren't so afraid of angering the old guard and instead focus on what would make the game become its ultimate self. Admittedly though, as much as as it sucks, I feel like a level of caution is always going to be there, because who are companies going to send to review your game? Probably the people who like the original the most and want it to be the most faithful. Who's most likely to flood the user score? Probably people who are going to complain about how it sucks that they changed things. I can't believe they butchered my favorite game ever made, said 3 people who played the game originally when it came out, and about 3,000 others that played it 8 months ago so they could have a more niche answer to the question, what's your favorite game ever made? Video game remakes are unnecessarily complicated and non-uniform. It feels like everyone has their own take on what they should do, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and usually it's kind of both. Where you sit there like, wow, that was great, but then if you think about it for a while, you realize, wow, that could have fixed a few more issues, or it could have actually been the game that it said it was. To me, all a remake needs to do is recognize what makes something great, preserve it, and then make changes around it to improve on something that was already amazing. If you think about it, remakes should year in and year out be the absolute best games coming out, because they already have a proven formula, an amazing foundation, and now more development time, plus a new coat of paint. But there's only a few that ever hit that mark, and even ones that do sometimes leave stuff on the table. I hope the industry gets better at stabilizing remakes as time goes on, because like I said, I think they're actually really beneficial to a lot of people, but I have a feeling that fans changing expectations and the focus on visual overhauls is going to stop that from happening for quite some time. What are you guys' thoughts on remakes? Are you sick of them? Do you want them to be a certain way when they're made? Do you like that the goalpost changes from game to game? And what are some of your favorites overall? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you're new here, subscribe, and I'll see y'all next time. Peace.